famous prologue of the Logos in the Gospel of John is an imitation of the opening monologue of Dionysus in the Bacchae. My God, why have you forsaken me? When Hector dies, he realizes that his god Apollo has abandoned him. Social identity and cultural political reason to rewrite the gospel narrative to describe the death of a hero and its relationship to a death of a city. Imitations of stories in the Hebrew Bible and from the Greek world as a way of crafting a new hybrid identity for the early Christian movement. In the Bacchae, the Maenads are out in the wilderness and they can use a wand to strike a rock and to have it produce wine or water. Ancients saw these similarities. We ought to have a more scientific way to assess what is the likelihood that one theory is better than another.
Welcome to Gnostic Informant, and today I'm here with a special guest. Harvard graduate, PhD, professor in New Testament theology and Christian origins, and he's a professor right now at Claremont School of Theology. He pioneered the Mimesis Criticism and the Q Papias hypothesis. These are important conversations happening right now in the Christian origins world. And you wrote many great works such as Acts of Andrew, Homeric Epics of Mark, Luke and Virgil, Gospels and Homer, and many more. I'm not going to name them all, but those are just a few of many of your great works. And I'm glad to have you here today. Thank you for coming on, Dennis.
Oh, Neil, it's a pleasure to be able to talk about my work.
Yeah.
I actually, at some point, want to advertise another publication that's coming out that I'm hoping will be available for nothing as a PDF. And
Wow.
I call it a mimetic synopsis. It's an English synopsis of the Gospels that includes my reconstruction of Q on the basis of the Q plus Papias hypothesis that you mentioned. But it also has extensive excursus and introductions to various narratives in which I give my own translation of the Homeric Epics or Athenian tragedy, emphasizing Greek poetry as possible literary models for the story. There's nothing like it in any language. And it's intended to be a vademecum, a work that anybody who's serious about the Gospels can go to consult if they are happy consulting something in English and not in Greek. I did it in English simply because the parallels actually are closer with an English translation than they are in Greek, because Homeric and Athenian poetry Greek are so different from Koine.
Right. That's a good point. And a lot of people don't realize that. People think about, look at the Greek right now with the capital letters, and they think it always was that way. But if you go back to the time of the Gospels, the Koine, however you pronounce it, Koine, it's just different letters. It almost looks like a different dialect in a way.
Well, it's the same letters, but it is a different dialect.
Yeah.
And the difference between archaic Greek and the Greek of the New Testament was actually a point of lamentation for ancient students in school in the Roman Empire, because they hated having to learn the Greek language for cultural reasons, because it was something they never use, on the street.
I want to ask you, has anyone ever put together a reproduction of Q? Or are you the first one doing that? Because
No. There have been many reconstructions of Q.
Okay.
And they are all hypothetical reconstructions based on certain criteria that scholars use. I happen to think that the criteria that had been used for earlier reconstructions, and as far as I know, the first reconstructions are now about 100 years old. So we've been a century at this. But the criteria I use, I think, avoid some of the shortcomings of other reconstructions.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to see the way you put together the queue of how it should be based on your Papias hypothesis and just your knowledge and your background of how you already understand all this stuff, because this is not easy work to reconstruct a lost document. You know what I mean? It's not just like anybody can just do that.
No, and people have been working at it in teams for decades.
Yeah,
So it's not for the faint of heart.
right. So let's get into. I want to talk about. Let's get into some like Greek influence. You know, I got, as you can see right here, I got the Homeric and Virgil classics right here.
Beautiful.
And I want to talk about not even just these though, even like Ovid's Metamorphosis and the Orphic mysteries, and even going back to like the Lusianian mysteries, just like all these concepts that were like popular in that world, and how they influence New Testament, and even just the you know, just theology, philosophy in general in the going into the church era.
Um, I'm so grateful that you're interested in that topic. I'm going to try to delimit the topic a little bit for our conversation.
Sure.
The texts that you mentioned are available in the East-speaking Roman Empire, that is the world of the New Testament. There's no doubt about it. But there were certain texts that were more popular and influential than others. So one of the criteria that I use for mimesis criticism is, were these texts widely available? Another is analogy. Do we have other examples of people imitating the same works? So some of the texts that you mentioned actually are really quite remote. We don't have many copies of them. They weren't used in schools. They weren't imitated on the stage, but others were extremely important. And the ones that you're holding on your desk were the most important monuments of Greek and Roman mythology, without doubt. And all three of those books were influential in the world of the New Testament, more so than almost any other books. You could add a few of the Athenian tragedies to that list, especially those of Euripides. You could add a few of the Platonic Socratic dialogues. They would be popular as well. And they were used in schools and other people imitated them. But the number of texts that I think we should talk about, Neil, are really quite few. Now, why were these texts the ones that people wanted to rewrite? It's not just because they were great literature, and it's not in order to learn Greek letters. It was to learn how to be Greek, or in the case of the Aeneid, how to be Roman. That is, they were cultural monuments as well as literary monuments. So when Jews tried to establish their identity in the Greek world, it was Homer and Euripides and Plato that were the ones to engage in the New Testament. It's again Homer and the poets that you need to engage to establish your alternative identity. And it's not I'm so glad you put the Aeneid right next to Homer. Not only does Virgil imitate the Homeric Epics, but he does so in order to craft an alternative identity for Romans, to show that Aeneas is superior to the likes of Odysseus, who's a stinker. He founds an empire in a way that Achilles doesn't, the way that Odysseus doesn't. And the empire goes all the way to Augustus.
Right.
Who's his big buddy and supporter. So the texts that you're talking about that are on your desk are the ones that became the great targets for the crafting of alternative social identities.
Yeah, and I've read some theories about Virgil sort of being a propagandist for the Augustan regime, and that
Absolutely.
yeah, and that the allegories, not just the allegories, but just the stories within the Aeneid are sort of like these pro Augustus, like look how great he is themes.
Well, that was how it was actually interpreted already with early commentators, Latin commentators of Virgil. But modern literary critics have opened that question up in an interesting way, Neil. That is, that there are some passages in the Aeneid where Virgil seems to be subtly critical of the violence of the Pax Romana or Augustus, and so it's an encomium, but it's not a panegyric. That is, it's praise, but it's not excessive praise. And so there are places where modern critics have made, I think, an interesting and usually a compelling case that Virgil is taking swipes at Augustus as well as patting him on the back.
Interesting. So, how do you think it influenced, like Mark or Q, for example, the earlier Gospels? Where do you see some good examples of they're taking, you know what I'm saying, some reflections or some parallels?
Oh, I could go on and on and on. You know, I don't know how much time we have to talk, Neil, but we don't have enough time to take that.
Yeah,
So let me be concise and give you one
sure.
example, and then we can spin out of it.
Yeah, sure.
It is clear that Mark, the earliest of the surviving Gospels, was writing soon after the Jewish War. And he thought that it was God's punishment for Jerusalem and Judea and Jews generally for not accepting the message of Jesus and for killing him. And he's interested in writing a narrative to make sense of the carnage of the recent Jewish war. And let me ask you, is there one of the books that is on your desk that ends with the anticipation of the destruction of a great city because one of its heroes has died?
I would say obviously the Iliad.
The Iliad is a story of the destruction of Troy
Yeah,
because Hector now is dead and he can no longer protect it.
right.
And by the way, it's similar in the Aeneid, except the tables are turned. In this case, Turnus dies, and that means that the Rutulians and other Latins are going to have to assimilate with the Trojans under Aeneas's guidance.
Right.
So Mark has a good social identity and cultural political reason to rewrite the gospel narrative to describe the death of a hero and its relationship to a death of a city. And the parallels go on and on, Neil. The one that's so amazing is Jesus says, and this was scandalous to the other gospels, except for Matthew,
Yeah.
my God, why have you forsaken me?
Right. That would seem as
And,
almost a blasphemous thing to say from a Jewish standpoint. And I know
well, yeah,
even Muslims today say our prophet would never say that. That didn't happen. Like, so yeah, like you said.
well, and Luke changes it to into your hands I commend my spirit.
Right, right.
So Matthew can, but in the Iliad, when Hector dies, he realizes that his god Apollo has abandoned him. Now
Wow.
he has to die. Three women watch and mourn in the Iliad to Hector's death. His mother
Yeah.
Hecuba, his wife Andromache, and his stepsister Helen. Yeah, go ahead.
if you watch the movie with Brad Pitt, you won't get the context as you would when you read it from Homer, because it actually, the scene when Hector dies is very much like the scene when Jesus is dying. It's very dramatic, very played out, very drawn out. It's not just a quick scene of him getting dragged by a chariot. It is like dramatic. Like I said, it's a lot bigger of a deal in the text than it is in the movie.
Absolutely. And in fact, this this is an invitation to anybody out there who's a movie director. I think a movie is waiting to be made, or kind of a TV series that puts one story from Homer and another from the Gospels back to back, maybe with the same actors, and you would see these parallels immediately. Well, one more thing about the death of Hector.
Sure.
His body is taken by Achilles, and it has to be ransomed by Priam, Hector's father, and brought back to burial. Well, Joseph of Arimathea. What was the Jesus's father's name? Joseph of Nazareth, according to the tradition. But it's Joseph of Arimathea. Nobody has been called Arimathea in the history of the world except for this man. Why?
What does that mean?
In Greek, it means excellent disciple. He's the excellent disciple, whereas the others are not. And he dares to go to Pilate and ask for the body, and he comes and buries it. Well, guess what? Jesus rises from the dead in the way that Hector didn't. So Jesus isn't like Hector. He's different from Hector.
But I just thought of something. King Priam goes and sees Achilles, and he begs to get his son's body for a proper burial, as if he didn't, he was going to be dead forever. And like, as if this burial rite is so important that it has to do with his afterlife. So in a way, King Priam is getting the body of his son Hector and getting him eternal life through this Greek rite, through this whatever it is, this ceremony. And it was like, he was so adamant that it had to happen. It was like life or death. And
and in fact, we know what that's about because of the Odyssey. A young Elpenor dies, and his soul can't get into Hades for eternal rest unless Odysseus goes back and buries his body. The same thing's true for Patroclus. Patroclus's eidolon, his image, floats around until he can be buried, and then his body go into the netherworld. So you're really onto something. But I would still say that Hector dies. At least his body now can have a repose with the dead in Hades. But Jesus comes back to life. But your identification of the burial as important for the eternal state of Hector is a very good one.
So let me ask you this and see if you agree with this, and if you don't, take it away and tell me where I'm wrong and correct me on this. In the Aeneid, I always say Aeneid. I always say it wrong. I don't know why. That's how I am with names. In the Aeneid, it starts off with Aeneas is going through to find the city of Latium, but he's coming from the destruction of what just happened in Troy. And I almost wanted to know, is there a parallel between the destruction of Troy and the building of Latium as there is in the destruction of the Jewish temple and the building of the church? Is there a parallel there? What do you think about that?
I hadn't thought about it. I think the first thing that you're saying certainly is right. That is, I think already Mark identifies the destruction of Jerusalem with the tragic destruction of Troy.
Right.
And you could say that then there is an attempt to have a new settlement and a new homeland, both for the Trojans and for early Christians. Here's one of the tricks, though, Neil, and it's one that I haven't figured out, and maybe other people can. It's clear that the authors of the New Testament, if they could read and compose in Greek, had been exposed to Homer. It's not so clear that they'd been exposed to Virgil, and to what extent they could read Latin.
Yeah.
Now, I actually think that a case for bilingualism among Greek elites has been downplayed. I really think that it was more widespread. We have lots of evidence of it in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, somewhat less in the 1st century when at least some of the Gospels were written. But we do know that people had slaves who were bilingual, that there were other people who could, and by the way, Virgil was not just textually accessible, but it was accessible through other media, artwork, for example, and statuary and so on.
Yeah, that's a good point. Now, do you think there's an underlying philosophy between all these, like maybe Platonic philosophy, Pythagorean? Do you think there's some sort of it's like a underlying common thread between all these texts?
No, I think that would be going too far.
Okay.
But one can say is that much of Homer was read with Platonic eyes. And so going back to Plato and Plato-Socrates, Plato argued that the Homeric myths should not be told by women to children, and soldiers aren't going to be willing to fight if they read the Aeneid because people are dying everywhere and so on.
Wow.
And later on, then, it was thought that Plato and Homer were enemies. But then there was an impulse to make Plato and to make nice between Homer and Plato. And so then Homer could be read platonically. And early Christians probably read it that way too, so that the Odyssey becomes an Odyssey of virtue, much like Pilgrim's Progress would later on. But I think it would be difficult to talk about. You could talk about a common Greek culture, but I don't think you can talk about common Greek philosophical ideas.
That's a good point. And this kind of just popped in my head. A lot of people like to connect the Eleusinian mysteries of Persephone descending into Hades and rising back up, and the rites that the Pythagoreans use of eating bread and having they like to connect that with the later church, with Jesus dying, rising back up. I want to know what you think about that, because I know you probably know a little bit more about that than the average person.
I think the contacts to the mysteries are more obvious through Dionysus than through the Eleusinian mysteries, which seems to be much more localized. But the Bacchae was performed throughout the Roman Empire, presumably, even though we don't have any single continuous text of the book. It breaks off at the end with our best manuscript. But it certainly was imitated widely in antiquity. So in that case, one of my books is called The Dionysian Gospel, which argues that the Gospel of John is heavily indebted to Euripides' Bacchae. And we know that Jewish imitations existed as well. Now, there's a relationship, though, between the Dionysian mysteries and the Eleusinian mysteries. Yes. And of course, Dionysus is one of the few deities that of whom it is said died and then was exalted.
Yeah.
So you have that as also a part of the dying, rising Eleusis mysteries related to Persephone and so on.
Yeah, they seem to be connected in that way, because I know Orpheus was the high priest of Dionysus in Ovid's Metamorphosis. So they sort of connect these Orphic mysteries to the Dionysian Bacchus. But I know one of the glaring, I think the most obvious ones, is the water to wine, the John 5, the wedding at Cana, where it almost seems like, I don't want to say plagiarism, but like it's very obvious that there's some connection between those two texts. I don't know if you want to touch on that.
Yeah, it's actually John 2.
Oh, I'm sorry, John 2.
No, but Neil, the reason that the location is important is in in my view, the famous prologue of the Logos in the Gospel of John is an imitation of the opening monologue of Dionysus in the Bacchae. And when you get to chapter 3 of John, you have a passage that said this was, no, at the end, I'm sorry, at the end of the story of the wedding at Cana, we're told that this is the first of Jesus's signs. Now that means that this is his inaugural ball,
Right.
in which he is demonstrating who he is. And in chapter 3, you have a note that John had not yet been imprisoned. And that means that, and in the Synoptics, John is imprisoned soon after the temptation story. So everything that happens in the Gospel of John prior to chapter 3 is earlier than anything in the Synoptics. And here the John community is saying, hey, you want to know who Jesus is? Right out of the gate. He is the Logos who tents among us and takes on human flesh and is disguised, but is the donor deity, gift after gift. He gives eternal life and so on. And let me tell you what his first thing is. He goes to a wedding where sex is being celebrated. People are already drunk, and he makes some more wine for them, and it's better than any other wine there.
Right.
Tell me that isn't Dionysian. And the
100%.
ancients recognized it.
Yeah, that's very Dionysian. I mean, there's even a title that gives Dionysus is one of his titles is the god of wine, the vine god or whatever. And that they always refer to Jesus as the vine, the true vine.
Yeah.
So that's very obvious. I was talking to another scholar whose his main area of expertise is in Mesopotamia, way back, Sumerian Akkadian text, and he said the same thing was going on even back then, where they would take Ninurta is the old ancient deity that everybody looked up as like a savior, kind of like how Jesus is. But he said later on they took the same sort of themes and applied it to Marduk and say, oh, you like Ninurta? Well, now look at Marduk. He's doing the same thing, but even better. So it almost seems like people, it's not like they're copying, but they're sort of borrowing from and sort of making a new version that applies to the times that they're in and to the audience that they're speaking to.
That's extremely important methodologically.
Yeah.
Mimesis is not plagiarism. Mimesis is an art form that trades on the virtues of recognized models that readers are expected to recognize, but transforms them and emulates them, that is, rivals them.
Yeah.
And another piece, Neil, that's often underplayed is that students were taught to model more than one text at a time. It's called eclectic mimesis or hybrid mimesis. So what we have in the New Testament, for example, is hybrid mimesis, where you have imitations of stories in the Hebrew Bible and from the Greek world as a way of crafting a new hybrid identity for the early Christian movement. So that mimesis and social identity go hand in glove. Mimesis is not something that people do in their study and they have fun, copying a text.
Right.
It's what they do in their communities to help communities describe themselves in a world that sometimes is hostile.
Yeah, and I think a good example of that in the modern world is in music, especially like hip hop music, for example. You'll see the beat will sound like an old song from the 70s or 80s, but they sort of add the bass to it, a treble, and then they add different verses and different lyrics. But it has the same vibe, and it's sort of this like a rework, and no one calls that plagiarism. Everyone loves it. It's good stuff. Like I would compare that to what you're talking about in the ancient world with the scripture.
Oh, and you have it in the visual arts too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and John seems like a lot of people point to John as very Gnostic-y, because it talks, Gnostics love talking about the logos and some of the more spiritual concepts. But I would also argue that John has a lot of Greco mythology themes as well. Like we already talked about Dionysus. But what do you is there any other Dionysian parallels to the book of John or even other gospels?
Oh, what about the woman at the well?
Oh, yeah.
In the Bacchae, the Maenads are out in the wilderness, and they can use a wand to strike a rock and to have it produce wine or water. So Jesus produces, and this woman who's at the well in book 4 of John is herself promiscuous. That was one of the things that the Maenads were accused of. The Maenads are the first ones to accept this new religion in the city, and they're worshiping out in the mountains. The Samaritan woman says, should we worship in this mountain or should we worship in Jerusalem? She's the first person to accept Jesus, and then she goes back and the men in the city accept him as well. I mean, the parallels go on and on.
That's a good one.
I mean, I could give a few other examples. By the way, ancients saw these similarities in the history of the reception of these texts. These similarities were respected.
Right. Yeah. So I'm saying people were aware of this stuff, and that's not a bad thing. This is just the way it was. Like that's how they are. Like, I have a question that just popped in my head. Actually, there's this conspiracy that there's this stone that was discovered. It's a stone that says Orpheus Bacchus on it, and it's a guy being crucified. I don't know if you ever saw this.
No.
No? Okay. Well, I can't really ask you anything about it then. But supposedly there's the discussion is it from like later 3rd century, or is it from the time where the Bacchae?
Well, if you can send me that information, I'll take a look at it and get it back to you.
I can pull it up real quick. Let me pull it up
right.
real quick. Why not?
See it? Oh yeah, beautiful. Wow.
So there's two different schools of thought that some people say this was made way later, and then the other people are saying, well, this could be a second century ish, first, second, maybe even third ish. What do you think about it? I mean, obviously you don't have time to look that up, but it appears to look like it's the type of Greek that you would see back in those days, right?
I think it's really fascinating. I'd like to see what other people do with it.
Yeah.
It's not so clear to me that that's a cross. It could also be an anchor.
I think it is an anchor. Okay,
so in that case, it's not necessarily the cross figure.
That's true. That's a good point. That's actually a good observation that I haven't really heard yet. Or maybe I have, but I just didn't really. Maybe it's out there. I just didn't see it. I didn't see it yet. What do you think about the 7 stars on the top? What does that mean?
Well, usually in art, when you have stars like that, it can either be ornamental, but it can also mean that it's a heavenly scene. So that, for example, the Dioscuri of Castor and Pollux and so on often have stars above their head to show that these are not the deities on earth, but they're glorified deities. So my guess is that, and then you have the half crescent moon dish up there. My guess is that this is to talk about the glorified Orpheus and Bacchus.
Yeah, and that's another question. Why is Orpheus and Bacchus on there? Is that Orpheus, or who is? You know what I mean? I'm just throwing questions out there.
Well, the two cults have a strange relationship to each other.
Yeah, we talked about that for a second.
And Orpheus sometimes are considered enemies, and sometimes they're considered companions. But it's likely that Orphism is a spin-off of a Bacchic religion, as I understand it.
Yeah, because in Ovid's Metamorphosis, it's very to me it was very confusing because it said Orpheus was the high priest of Bacchus, and then Orpheus gets killed by the Maenads, and they say that or Bacchus is the one who sent them out to kill him. why did that happen? I mean, and then I guess, and then what's his name? King Midas, when he gets the golden touch. I thought this was pretty interesting too. And I wonder if this is another parallel. He goes and washes his sins in the river, in the same river that Orpheus died in.
Yeah, those are very good observations, and I'm really not an authority on that part of that mythology.
Yeah,
good for you.
Yeah, it's just fascinating to pick apart this stuff. I just love make my own theories about the past, and running them by people like you just to see where I could be wrong, where it could, you know what I'm saying, to get some more perspective. And I think it's pretty fun to do that. But yeah, like it's just, you know, I think it's pretty fast. Like we were talking about, these parallels, they sort of give us a glimpse of who these people were and where they were at mentally, spiritually.
Okay, my turn to ask a question of you, Neil.
Sure.
You've obviously saturated yourself in a lot of this stuff, and
yeah.
Why does it have so little traction in the culture? When people, I guess it's because they simply don't know Greek mythology and Greek poetry and so on. Have you found resistance from people accepting your ideas of these connections?
Not really. It's not that I found resistance, but I'll get different theories. Like people will say, that's interesting that you see it that way. I see it this way. And there's just so many wide varieties of how people interpret these parallels or whatever, these themes, I guess you could say.
Right.
I guess that would be more of the reception I get from when I come out with these theories. It's not really pushback. It's more just like, well, that's interesting, but I see it this way. And everybody has their own spin on how they see it based on what they've read, based on their knowledge and what they know. So that's another fascinating aspect of all this. So this is some deeply rooted stuff here.
Well, unfortunately, it shouldn't just be our prejudices. We ought to have a more scientific way to assess what is the likelihood that one theory is better than another.
I agree.
And I just think there's been way too much processing and not enough science.
I totally agree with that. I mean, there's so much misinformation out there. People will just blatantly tell people things that aren't even true just to get some clicks and some views, and there's really no way of, like, when it comes to academic papers and stuff like that. Yeah, you won't pass. You won't get your book published. You won't get your peer review. But on YouTube, people could just do whatever they want. They could just say whatever. Right. You know, that is a problem. I agree. And how do you balance like freedom of expression and art between being academic and scientific? That's a real question right there. How do you do that?
Oh, I think that's the difference between being an amateur and a pro in this field.
Yeah.
That if you're a pro, you need to justify your theories to others. You need to craft argumentation. You need to give evidence. You need to engage with alternative theories.
Yeah.
And of course, all of that is hard work. And as we know, our culture right now is not big on experts. It's not big on science. And there's a big suspicion of intellectuals in the culture largely. So I think we've got some cultural work to do as well as literary work.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think like something like what I'm doing right now is having on people like you to run by these ideas I think it's a healthy start to find to find a medium between people like me who do this for fun and the people who actually are professionals and experts. Like that, there needs to be more dialogue between those two sides, and that I think that would help a lot.
Scholars often talk about the two different kinds of intellectuals, and I think what you're doing, Neil, is an intellectual task, but it's not the same as my task.
Oh no!
And the difference is the difference between a fox and a groundhog.
That's very true.
A fox can chase rabbits all day long and enjoy it. but without getting very deep to get the worms and the bugs that are underneath the ground. A groundhog spends most of his time or her time underneath the ground, burrowing and following leads and so on, and occasionally pops up. So I think some people like you who show these interests downplay your own intelligence, honestly, and your own sophistication. And the very fact that you were able to pull up that magical amulet indicates that you really are more than an amateur. You're you're an intellectual of a different type. But there also needs to be a respect for the groundhogs like myself.
Oh yeah.
Who go deep and pop up. They don't see as many things as you do, but they see some things a bit with a little more discipline than the fox.
That makes a lot of sense, because like people like myself, I'm willing to go in any area. I'll willing to get my hands dirty and look at all these different, and that could be bad in the sense that I can get immersed in a lot of misinformation without checking sources. Like I'm all over the place. Whereas like someone like you're not exactly in all these areas, but you're very disciplined and you're checking sources. You're making sure you have your facts straight. Everything's in the scientific method and everything's right. And you're not just going to come out with theories every day without checking it for like months and months and years sometimes.
But unless we groundhogs have foxes like you, our work may never get exposed.
Yeah, so it's good that we work together, and
yeah, absolutely, it really is important.
Yeah, that's a good thing to close on, I think. And okay. So 50 minutes is good, man. This has been a good talk, and I definitely want to keep in touch and have you back on. And I might have some more questions. Maybe we can revisit the amulet that I just pulled up after you've had some time to look into what it is and talk to your peers about it, and we can get some real truth on that.
Yeah. Okay, Neil. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming.
Take care,
all right, everybody. See you later.
Stay healthy.